Less than 48 hours. That's how long it took LOTRO developers to realize they made a mistake. From negative news articles on Massively and other news sites talking about the forum literally exploding, to over 400 posts on the forums, it's no surprise that the LOTRO developers decided to put a hold on the changes that they proposed. Cordovan took to the forums and said thank you to everyone who has provided us with extensive feedback over the past couple of days. We've been discussing things in-house, and we've decided to put these plans on hold for now. If we do end up moving in a new direction regarding embers, figments, and motes of enchantment in the future, we will make sure to incorporate as much of your feedback as we can. For now, the system, as it currently exists today, will remain in place, and the changes related to this subject that were previewed on Bullroar will not be in our next game update. I do want to go ahead and break down why I think there should be changes to the Ember system, why the developers' changes were not the right ones, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's go ahead and hop into this. So first of all, the Ember changes were indeed paused. That's awesome. Great job, community. We put those on hold. And so, if we stand together and tell Standing Stone Games that it's not a good move, they'll listen to us. And that's awesome. Hats off to Standing Stone Games for listening to their players. That's awesome. They have not done that always. And I'm really thankful that they did it this time. This is a time they really needed to. And they did. So we should definitely congratulate them for that. This is really, really good. So let's talk a little bit about the problem Standing Stone Games is hoping to solve, and I think needs to solve. So this is a quote from LOTRO's producer, Renenia, and they said, "The purpose of Embers was to act as a way to mitigate being unlucky with the RNG. However, what it turned into was the fastest and best way to get gear. We don't want players to run things that aren't the content the gear comes from as their primary way of getting that gear." Which I agree with. Players did still have to unlock whatever instance it was, but they then after that didn't have to do it again. To be fair, on some servers like Landerville, it is sometimes hard to get groups together. And with LOTRO's current player population, I think maybe having an Ember system isn't an entirely bad idea because of how hard it is to get a high-end upper tier rating group together on certain servers. It can be really, really challenging. And that's definitely a huge problem, which I think Standing Stone Games should try to solve with an instance finder or something like that so that they can, fix this problem a different way and, give players incentives to do that content. Anyway, I'm kind of getting distracted. Back to the problem. Players were buying gear instead of doing instances. That's the problem. It really was a problem, I think. Players were just doing like the tier 1 stuff to get Embers as fast as they could. And I don't think that that is at all what the developers intended. And I think it's honestly a little bit bad for the community. Great that so many runs are being done all the time, but not so great that the higher end stuff is not. So their fix to this problem was removing loot-based embers, which I think removing that completely is actually a mistake. We'll get to that in a moment. So since they removed the loot-based embers, they decided to increase the embers players could get from weeklies. It was going to be 3 times higher. They also were going to have new repeatables that players could do for embers. They were also going to have embers in other ways, like the epic story, in big one-time drops. And since the cap was higher, they could do these big drops. Players still have to unlock the loot by doing the instances at least once, but they would be potentially getting embers from a whole bunch of different areas. And so in theory, this doesn't solve the problem Standing Stone Games was trying to solve. They said their problem was that players weren't doing the instances, but they're offering embers for players not doing the instances. At least before, players were running like, 6-mans like stairs and things like that to get the gear from that and then break it all down. But here, players are just have to do the epic story or play other parts of the game that aren't even related to raiding, and they're getting embers to get the high-end gear. So I don't see how this was solving their problem. To me, they were just moving the problem. They also were going to have embers from the new reward track. We really don't know anything about the reward track too much, other than it's probably just, daily login rewards like other games offer. So at the same time of adjusting ways players could get embers, they were also going to adjust gear prices. This is taken directly from a quote from the producer on the forums saying that some ember prices would have increased with these changes 2 to 3 times on some of the gear. With changes like these, it completely negates the getting more embers from weeklies. So in theory, players were going to be getting the same relative amount of embers to the cost of the gear that they were getting from doing repeatables and things like that, but Standing Stone Games was completely removing all the embers players could get from loot, which is the majority of embers most players were getting. They did say that they wouldn't be multiplying the pricing by 10 times, even though they were multiplying the cap by 10 times. So they were reassuring players of that. They also said moat prices won't increase at all. So in theory, they were going to be moving gear to moats much faster. And so in theory, players could have gotten gear for cheaper a lot quicker with this system on the old gear at least. So now I'm going to try to break down what players were actually upset about from these changes as far as the embers themselves, not getting into pay to win yet, but just the embers. So this part of the document talks only about embers players could get from 1 week of doing stairs tiers 1, 2, and 3. From tier 1, you could do that every single day, which is about 500 per run, which means you can get about 3,500 just from stairs tier 1. You could get about 3,500 embers a week. From tier 2, you could get another 1,000, and from tier 3, you could get another 1,000, assuming you got about 500 per run. That means you could get 5,500 embers total per week just from one instance, not including the instance rewards that you get from like quests and things like that. This is just from the gear that you would be breaking down in one instance in LOTRO. Because of this, I really do think that this was actually too much. This was too many embers, and I think Standing Stone Games is actually right. They do have a problem. Players were getting too much good gear from embers too quickly. These incentives were so good that players had no reason at all to do the raids more than once. That's not entirely true. There were certain gears and things like that that only dropped from the raids, but in general, it meant a lot less runs of raids were incentivized for players. So I think a much better solution would have been decreasing the rewards from 6-mans and 3-mans, the amount of loot that drops there that can be broken down into embers, and increasing the incentive to do raids and things like that. And because it takes a lot longer to put together a raid group, making that loot be much, much better. I've always felt that the amount of time you put into a raid in LOTRO is not necessarily worth the amount of gear you get out of it, especially with this Ember system being in place. So I think Standing Stone Games was trying to solve the right problem. They just were not solving it with the right solution. And so that's why I'm actually glad that these changes are just on hold, because hopefully they'll listen to community feedback and actually make a much better game and a much better change to this system, because I do think a change does need to happen so that we can get more people playing through the actual raid content instead of playing through the low-end early instant stuff to get the high-end gear. So let's now talk about the PR problem of this announcement and pay to win in general. This is, again, a post from LOTRO's producer on the forums. They're responding to pay-to-win allegations, and they said, "We can certainly debate this, but I don't think that's what the end result will be. If we find that players can't acquire gear consistently by playing the game, we'll adjust to improve that." Here's the problem, though. Players didn't understand what the developers were actually doing. If you notice, there were a bunch of posts like this. This is just a player on the forums that said, "How do you get embers now? Are the weeklies still working?" And that's because the original post by Standing Stone Games didn't mention once any way players could get gear other than from loot boxes. They do like vaguely mention it down here, but honestly, most of this stuff about embers is about how you can't barter it and you can't do things. They don't actually break down all the ways players can get Embers still. And so a player reading this would read it totally differently than I think Standing Stone Games or LOTRO's producer imagined. Here, I think, is how the actual post was read by players. And this is where the pay-to-win allegations come in big time. This is a quote from the final sentence of the Embers section of the article that they released about the changes. They said, "The only gear that disenchants into Embers will come from Adventurers loot boxes." I've put in bold and underlined what players actually read from this. Only Embers from loot boxes. And at no point is there any mention of other ways players can get gear. I'd also like to point out that Standing Stone Games brought up loot boxes, not the players. Players responded to loot boxes with pay to win, as you rightly should, because loot boxes, the term, is tied to pay to win. And I'd like to take a quick second to explain what pay to win actually means, because there was a huge misunderstanding by a bunch of people in response to my video. Obviously, you can't win LOTRO. So the win in pay to win doesn't mean winning LOTRO. The win means winning the grind. You're paying money to beat the grind. Think of it this way. Let's say all the players in LOTRO are in jail. And the only way that you can get out of jail before being convicted is to pay bail. You have to post bail. Or in other words, the only way players can get out of the grind is to either do the time and stay in jail, or they can pay bail, pay for loot boxes, and get out of jail. Even if the mechanics don't work that way, even if players don't use it, even if all these things don't happen, the perception players have now is that they are in a grindy jail, and the only way to skip the grind is to pay. And so when Standing Stone Games makes changes like these, and they only mention the way to get embers is from loot boxes, players assume that these changes are made specifically for the loot boxes. After all, that's the only thing Standing Stone Games mentioned. Now, I don't think this is actually what Standing Stone Games intended. I think Standing Stone Games was just being honest to their players. I think they were saying that you can't get embers from anywhere. But if they said you can't get embers from anywhere, that's not true, because there's loot boxes. So they had to mention that you could get loot boxes, and because they had to mention they got loot boxes, they mentioned it. And so they were actually just being honest with players. But because they were being honest with players, and they didn't mention all the other ways players could still get embers, players read this as, we are making these changes so that players will pay money to skip the grind. We are artificially introducing this grind so players will pay us. That is how players took this. And so it's no surprise that players think this is pay to win, when really I do think these changes need to happen. Players are getting too many embers. You can get to cap easily within a week just by doing a few instances and getting the gear from that. And so players were getting too many embers. Standing Stone Games saw that, they tried to make a change, and because they were being honest with their players about ways players could still get embers from loot, players interpreted that as a PR nightmare of the only way to get embers is from loot boxes. And also, I think most players actually forgot loot boxes even exist in LOTRO. If you put it in the filter, it goes away and you never think about it again. And so for a lot of players, this was no longer an issue. They out of sight, out of mind, loot boxes weren't there for them. But Standing Stone Games brought up loot boxes again. And because Standing Stone Games brought up loot boxes again, this one sentence, specifically 4 words from this one sentence, stoked the fires of an old debate about loot boxes and created this PR disaster. Because now, if Standing Stone Games makes any changes to this Ember system, in the back of minds of players, there will still be that perception of maybe this is pay to win. Now they really can't make changes without being very clear to players and being very clear to themselves what the changes actually are. And I think that this is a horrible thing for the game. This PR nightmare, it's great that we stopped the changes from happening, but it is not great that there will be potentially no changes happening. And so that's why I'm actually glad that the changes are on pause. Because if the changes weren't just on pause, we might never fix this problem that I think needs to be fixed if we want there to be a lot of players doing raids again. Now, an easy solution could just be giving players even more embers in the raids and things like that. But I think that that will just cause even more bloat, and this problem just continues to grow. And that is unfortunate. And so, ironically, I think the real casualty in this whole PR disaster is actually the game. The PR itself, I don't think is that big of a deal because they did go back on it pretty quickly. But there's now this perception that this change can never happen, and that's not good. Now, I did find an interesting response from the producer about loot boxes. Here's a quote that I actually wrote out because the text is super small here on my screenshot, but I promise you this was straight from the forums. If players choose to spend LOTRO points on loot boxes, that's been their choice for a long time, which is true, but maybe not the way you should say it. But those are supplemental options. Our focus is on better aligning the experience. Right now, most players are not interested in running Tier 3 Plus for most content after they've gotten their individual completion. And we think these changes will help improve that issue. I'm not naive enough to think that it'll fully solve everything once and for all, but improvement is still a worthwhile goal. I love this producer. They always want to improve the game, and I really do think that this was not actually a pay-to-win scheme. It's just the honest way it was presented to the players made it seem super obvious that it was pay-to-win. Speaking of good things about this producer, I did want to read the first part of their response to players' concerns. Alright, gonna go ahead and see if I can provide answers and context on stuff here. I was the big driver of this change, so any frustrations or questions can be politely directed at me, and I'll do my best to address it. Any successes are the team's. That is a leader. He takes full responsibility for the problems, but he gives all the credit to his team on everything that's good. That is a producer LOTRO needs. That's a producer every game needs as far as I'm concerned. Yes, this change wasn't a good one. Yes, the rollout was awful. But they turned around and now they're taking ownership. Like, this is a really good response in my opinion. All right, so I do have a few final questions. The first one was, why now? Why'd they make these changes now? They felt so rushed. They should have made these changes before Gundabad, but they were taking on way too much before Gundabad, so they couldn't. I think that this was another thing on their list of things they meant to get done before Gundabad that they didn't, that now they regretted not getting done, and we're trying to get it done as fast as possible still. But from a player perspective, changing how loot is going to be acquired completely after players have already paid for the expansion is a horrible idea. They should have either waited till after the raid came out to do this or done this before Gundabad. One of the two. Don't do it right before the new raid comes out. That's a horrible decision. I do understand that they knew that, there is this problem, but you don't fix this kind of a problem right before you have the piece of content that everyone is looking forward to. So another interesting thing I saw a lot of players mentioning on the forums was, why are you making these changes now when you're still trying to figure out all the LI changes, the classes, balance in general? Why are you changing another thing? There have been so many changes to LOTRO recently. I think, they need to take a break. They need to take a break and fix what they've already started to break and improve. The final question I'll leave you with is, why not remove loot boxes as well? I think if these changes are ever going to come about, the changes that are needed, the only way they can do that is if they remove loot boxes altogether. And why not remove loot boxes? They're illegal in some countries. They're probably going to be illegal in other countries very soon. Why are we engaging in a term that's associated with gambling? Why do you want to associate LOTRO with gambling? I know the changes they proposed had nothing to do with introducing loot boxes. They've been there this whole time. But the changes they proposed and the way they proposed them made loot boxes be prominent in players' minds again. And so now players are associating loot boxes with LOTRO. And that's ultimately the biggest travesty of this whole thing, I think, is that loot boxes have been brought back to the forefront of players' minds. So anyway, that's my thoughts on all of this PR craziness that's been going on in LOTRO over the last few days. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. Hopefully I gave a somewhat unique perspective. I really tried to dive into this and, took a lot of time to get this video out. So if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again real soon for more content.